So I'm going to read actually a part of Dan's bio because Dan, you're the man. There's a lot of things. I know you as a number of things and many of them in here, but it wouldn't be right to not capture it all. So Dr. Dan Engle, a renowned physician, psychiatrist, and pioneer in integrative psychiatry and psychedelic therapy. With expertise in both Western medicine and ancient healing traditions, he's dedicated his career to finding innovative solutions for mental health challenges. Dr. Engle's work spans the fields of neurology, psychiatry, and peak performance coaching, helping individuals recover from brain injuries and optimize their cognitive health. He's author of the Concussion Repair Manual and A Dose of Hope, which explore healing the brain through both traditional and alternative therapies. He is the co-founder of Thank You Life, an organization aimed at expanding access. That's why we're all here, and to hear Dan talk about a lot of brilliant things. He's deeply committed to the transformative potential of psychedelics in mental health treatment, particularly for vets and trauma survivors. And his approach bridges cutting-edge science and ancient wisdom to offer a path forward to profound healing and personal growth. I know Dan is my friend and colleague and mentor and ever teacher. He is one of the most humble men I know, so full of integrity. And I just have so much appreciation for you in this arena and in this work and in this time as a lighthouse, both in my own coming back to life and for so many people. And I'm honored to be a part of those who can now pay it forward. So please join me in welcoming my dear friend, Dr. Dan Engle.
Thank you, Kelsey.
You're
Yeah,
welcome.
super beautiful. And thank you, Laura. Thank you both for introducing us and bringing our group together. Thank you to all of our team members here on the call as well. It's been a privilege of mine to see our team start to flourish ever more under the excitement that has been Thank You Life, the early successes that were beyond our expectations. And I think, Kelsey, to your point, it does humble me to be a part of this team, to be a part of this movement. And at this time, I want to echo, Kelsey, what you said. Thank you for everybody here on the call, taking your time to be with us. It's no small task to take out a portion of our calendars and share a story. And that's what this Fireside chat is about. And I've had the privilege of doing at least one, maybe two Fireside chats in the past. And I always appreciate Laura's fireplace in the background actually giving us the semblance of having a fireside chat. My hope is that we have the opportunity to share some information and stories and answer questions that you may have. Our group is relatively intimate. We've done other fireside chats where there are quite a few more people. And part of the benefit of having an intimate group is that there can be a lot of dialogue and questions, and you can feel free to use the chat box if that's the best way. I think that's probably the best way our team is going to be funneling any questions that come live. I've got a number of questions from the group already, and these are all excellent questions that I'll get to towards the end. So I'll start off with a little bit about why we're here at this time and share some more stories, and then we'll go into breakout rooms. And I'll give you a couple of prompts to be able to share so we can get to know one another better. Like we were sitting around a big fire and then a few of us just nestled up and said, let's talk about this little thing for a moment. And then we'll come back, and all of this will take us around an hour and a half or so. So we're slated for 90 minutes. So it seems fitting that we would be having this conversation in this month of, I had to actually look at my calendar to verify that I knew what month it was, because we just got back from a 5-week road trip in this month of September. And what I've known about this month for quite some time is that it is Suicide Prevention Month. And some of you may know, and a good number of you don't know, that the reason that we're actually having this call and the reason that Thank You Life exists is because my older sister, one of my older sisters, on my dad's side passed away from suicide about 10 years ago. And I had been a practicing physician for many years and been connected with the medicine path and exploring the medicine path domestically and internationally. I've lived abroad and consulted with other organizations globally on medicine work, but it was all underground up until the point my sister passed. My family didn't know anything about what I was doing. This is she passed 10 years ago. I started my medicine path about 20 years ago. So for close to 10 years, my family didn't know anything about psychedelic therapy, and they didn't know I was doing anything with psychedelic therapy. And by the way, most of our society at the time didn't really appreciate the benefit or the power of psychedelic therapy because the old propaganda around this is your brain on drugs, the DARE campaign and the fried eggs commercial with Nancy and Ronald Reagan really pounded it into our collective psyche that drugs are bad, and that includes psychedelic therapies. Those are drugs too. Everything's illegal, stuck away in the same classification as heroin. And my sister was in this time in between, this time in the 50s, 60s, and 70s where a lot of research was very prevalent. And it was super exciting. And then the Nixon administration, in one very quick move, put all of that research on hold for 30 years because everything quickly went into Schedule 1, which means it's illegal and it has a high, they're illegal because there's no known medical value and they're highly addictive. And all of our medicines that we could have a conversation about, ketamine, MDMA, psilocybin, ayahuasca, peyote, cannabis is still federally Schedule 1. Iboga, some more esoteric medicines, LSD, I think I mentioned, all those medicines none of those medicines deserve to be in Schedule 1 because they all have medical known benefit. And most, if not all of those, are actually therapeutic for addiction recovery. So we're in this time now where there's more research, there's more excitement. Most of this is a grassroots movement. And maybe 2/3 of it's a grassroots movement and 1/3 of it is a clinical research movement because the research is good. It's becoming more and more popular. And the field of psychiatric medicine has more hope than ever because as long as I've been alive, we have not had curative treatments in psychiatry. And now we do. There are a couple of caveats there. We do have some curative esoteric treatments like electroconvulsive therapy is a curative treatment, but it's for a subset of people and it has a whole lot of side effects. So suffice it to say that psychedelic therapy is more curative than anything psychiatry has known in the last close to 100 years. Very low side effect potential when done well, when offered in a therapeutic setting, and potentially rising in popularity at the right time. So just a little bit of a personal note. Part of our 5-week trip that we just got, my lady Sonia and I just got back from, we were up in British Columbia in Canada and visiting some of the old growth forests. And I was reading about the old growth forests in North America. 98%, I think maybe it's 90% now, but it's scheduled to be 98% of all old growth forest have already been logged or are scheduled to be logged. And that might sound like, oh, that's British Columbia and that's a far way away. But it really landed for me. And when I saw what that devastation looks like, and it was another example of how myopic and kind of nearsighted our vision can be at times. And let me not say that I haven't been myopic in my own lifetime, for sure. And I wouldn't be having this conversation with you if it wasn't for the medicine path that I was graced to be able to be introduced to about 20 years ago. So when I am using the term medicines, I mean psychedelic therapies that are used therapeutically for healing. And when I'm using the term medications, I'm talking about pharmaceuticals. And when I'm using the term drugs, I'm talking about mind-altering substances that don't seem to have a therapeutic benefit and are highly dangerous. Those would be things like heroin, speed, or cocaine, or a variety of different illicit drugs that may provide a momentary pause in a person's suffering, but over the long stream have a lot of dangers associated with them. So I want to just give some language to what I'm speaking about. If I'm talking about medicines, I'm speaking about psychedelic therapies. And some people will put those medicines in the kind of the umbrella term of drugs, and I don't think they deserve to be there, because most of the medicines that I just listed, and we could have a long conversation about the history of medicines and how long we've been working with these over the last 200,000 years, at least as it relates to psilocybin mushrooms, and what our evolutionary consciousness has been catalyzed by in use of these medicines. So I'm curious to plant a seed now for the breakout room, to ask the small groups who on the call has experienced mind-altering medicine work by choice and for a therapeutic aim. And if you feel comfortable sharing that with the others, then the natural questions to follow would be, what was the reason that you came into the medicine path? What was the first kind of entry or curiosity? Because there's two primary doorways into medicine. One is therapeutic, or we could say healing. One doorway is the healing doorway. The other doorway is the optimization doorway. So that could also be like personal development, personal exploration, spiritual growth. The healing doorway is typically people desiring to heal from PTSD, addiction, pain, depression, anxiety. And the medicines that we're able to offer now, principally being ketamine. Unfortunately, MDMA just got a setback in its legalization. It's probably going to take another 2 years on the clock, which is a bit of a travesty, because there's still many people dying daily from the long-term exacerbations of PTSD or chronic trauma. And so that medicine is probably going to take a little while. And psilocybin is still illegal federally, but some states have had the cavalier drive to legalize them locally, principally Oregon and Colorado, and more states will soon follow. So as it relates to ketamine, ketamine's amazing for treating all 5 of those primary psychiatric epidemics that I just mentioned: depression, anxiety, PTSD, addiction, and chronic pain. And we can talk a little bit more. We'll talk a little bit more because some of the questions are specific to ketamine. And I want to just highlight that that's just one medicine, speaking about treatments that are above exponentially more effective than all the other treatments in the current standard of care of psychiatry, which is essentially medication management and talk therapy. Those are the 2 primary treatment arms. And those have a success rate of around 30%, plus or minus. You can look at a bunch of different numbers and they'll all average about that. Where we've seen in our results and the data that we've collected thus far, this year we're scheduled to work with 100 plus people in ketamine series, and those will include 600 or so ketamine sessions, because most people will go through around 6 ketamine treatments in a whole series. And the data that we've collated over the course of our work, which is about 18 months of data, is about 60 to 65% success. So we're already much better, right? We're twice as good at treatment. And then if you add the two variables of what those results look like long term, like the staying power. And if you look at standards of care, medication management, principally with talk therapy and ketamine, in the side effect profile, you see those two variables kind of separate ketamine therapy even further. Ketamine therapy has longer staying power than either medication management or talk therapy. People tend to do well and they tend to stay well, and oftentimes may need booster ketamine series or another session many months down the road, but it has more staying power than the current treatment, and it has much less side effects. So we're looking at different ways and reasons that all of this makes sense for us to be speaking about in the midst of this being Suicide Prevention Month. And today, specifically, interestingly enough, on September 17th, being National Encouragement Day. So kind of an encouraging message, at least from my humble perspective, because psychiatry has more hope than it's ever had in my lifetime. And we're only rising because all of this excitement has just happened in the last handful of years, and it's exponentially rising. Unfortunately, the legal landscape is still taking a fair bit of time, but there's many reasons you could say ketamine is actually the perfect medicine to be able to usher the gateway into greater legal psychedelic usage, because it's helping us prove our clinical management of people when they go through altered state experience and journey work. We onboard people with greater readiness of understanding who's ready to have a journey and who's not, as well as the preparation and the integration process on either side of this work, so that when, and it's short, it only lasts about an hour to hour and a half, versus when MDMA and psilocybin come on board, those are 4 to 6 hour journeys. So you're going to have a lot of additional complex variables. So ketamine therapy, for a lot of reasons, is very safe. You can be on medication, not on medication. There's very few contraindications. It does have an addiction profile. We'll talk about that because that was somebody's question. But overall, it's kind of a really good medicine for us to be using right now. And so Thank You Life we didn't fall into this beautiful position. We were co-creating this beautiful position to be the first nonprofit on the scene whose essential mission was to increase access to care for all the medicines that are legal. Right now, ketamine is just the only one that is legal, and when the others come on board, then we will roll those in mindfully. So we were the first one to come onto the scene, so to speak, with that mission, and we have just started to gain so much excitement, momentum, beyond what we had initially anticipated. Our data is better than we thought it was going to be. We've been able to impact the entire movement by collectivizing and kind of connecting different thought leaders and facilitators with one another to be able to evolve practices so that we're increasing the levels of excellence in this new standard of care model. So that's a little bit of where I see us at right now in this National Encouragement Day. I think there's a lot to be excited about in the field of psychiatry. You know now a little bit about my why. When my sister passed, I realized I couldn't stay quiet anymore and just be working with medicines in the background. I was really thrust into the drive to be an educator and advocate of this work. So that's what I've been doing over the last 10 years. And where I see us going is continuing this evolutionary trajectory with more and more medicines becoming available and us tracking the data. So our approach is to understand and appreciate the clinical aspects, the research aspects, and the storytelling aspects to be able to get the message out. So with that gives you a little bit of a prelude, and just to sprinkle some seeds into the conversation that you get to have with one another. And I'll just reiterate that the 2 reflective questions that you have the opportunity to share if you feel called are, what was your why in coming into medicine work? if you have had an experience, right? So that question, the first kind of question is, have you had an experience and why were you called to it? And the second question is, what was the impact that it had on you or is having on you now? And maybe you get a sense of how it's going to continue to impact you. But those are essentially the two questions. We're going to take 6 minutes for this breakout room dialogue. There's going to be 3 people or so in each group. So that gives you a 1 minute per person for each question, because each person will have 2 minutes. So does that make sense? And do you need me to repeat the questions, which I'm happy to do?
The questions, Dan, are also in the chat
Oh,
box,
fabulous. That makes it super easy.
I think.
Okay, amazing.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so we'll start a little timer. Maybe I can even, yeah, I have the timer on my side. So I'll start a 6-minute timer, and then we'll come back in 6 minutes. And then maybe if somebody feels called to share what that experience was like, then we can do that. Sound good? Amazing. Fabulous. That was fascinating and beautiful. And I'm so excited that I found myself in a breakout room by pushing the wrong button. So I got to be in the breakout room with Evan and Meredith's mom, Ty. And I'm wondering if I can take the liberty and share their 2 stories. They already gave me permission to share their 2 stories. And the reason I want to share their 2 stories is they both beautifully highlighted aspects that I think of this work are crucial. So I'll share a little bit about their stories, and then we'll talk about maybe more of like the architecture of this work and the different facets of life that it engages. So Ty may be the youngest 86-year-old woman that I've met.
87.
87, see? Proof right there.
There.
Pleasure to meet you, Ty.
Thank you.
And Ty was able to say that she's had 2 ketamine sessions, and the first one was super scary because it was so new, and it was like a disorienting experience, because if no one's had an altered state experience, particularly with ketamine, because when you're in the midst of ketamine, you really know it. It's very somatically and psychically different than the norm. Versus other medicines can be a little bit more subtle. And so the first one was a little disorienting, and she said that the second one was glorious. And there was so much love, and she was able to get intimate and right, so to speak, with death. And so I want to highlight those 3 things. First is the destabilization. The second is the reclamation of love. And the third is the rightness with the doorway out. And then Evan's story was somewhere in the middle, in that a very good friend of his best friend, died in kind of a freak ski accident. And it really sent his life upside down. And ketamine, according to him, like the quotes are, ketamine saved my life. And I would say personally the same thing for my life with ayahuasca. And I know many people have said the same thing with their experience with MDMA or other medicines, right? So Evan's highlighting that not only are these medicines effective for treating the things that we just talked about, anxiety, depression, PTSD, addiction, chronic pain, they're also good at helping us get off of the ledge, right? When we've tried so many other things, and my sister committed suicide after trying all the things that the standard of care said to do. She was in AA, she was on multiple serial psychiatric medications, in and out of therapy. Not good, not enough. And so fascinating with ketamine, it has that pattern interrupt aspect to it, maybe even more than any other medicine. It has this really consistent pattern interrupt. The reason people typically need 6 sessions is it doesn't have the staying power after just 1 or 2 sessions. It has much longer staying power if we kindle that pattern to continue to be interrupted over time. And no one's really talked so much about this, but I've seen this because I've also run traumatic brain injury clinics, is that ketamine is very good for decongesting the cerebral vasculature. And what I mean by that is neuroinflammation, like inflammation in the brain can happen for a variety of different reasons. Stress, head injuries, mold exposure, environmental toxicities, Lyme disease, a whole lot of things. Ketamine seems to be one of the most effective treatments at getting inflammation out of the brain. And oftentimes people standing on the ledge because they've tried everything else and like, I don't know what else to do. I've tried everything else and nothing seems to be working and I've lost hope. Oftentimes a person in that experience has massive neurologic inflammation. And ketamine seems to be one of the best treatments for that. And so if you had inflammation in your lungs or in your sinuses, I mean, think about like hay fever, right? And you take a Benadryl, wow, now you can breathe again. But if you didn't treat the hay fever cause in the first place, then that's going to come back after the Benadryl wears off, right? You follow me there? So what ketamine seems to do is it decreases the cerebral inflammation, the brain inflammation. But if we haven't found the causative factor of why the inflammation was there in the first place, then it's likely to come back. So this is where the whole field of integrative psychiatry is headed. We're coalescing these brain sciences and mind sciences together. Brain, hardware, mind, software. And if you're looking at a computer, we're all having this virtual conversation because of the glorious advent of the computer, of which I know very little about other than pressing a few things and occasionally they do what I want them to do. Most of the time they don't. And if I do know about computers, if you're trying to upgrade your experience or performance, it's best to address both the hardware and the software. Get a new computer and have the best operating system to be able to do the things that you want it to do, right? So the psychiatric field is starting to coalesce what we know about brain sciences and mind sciences together, neurology and psychiatry together. We haven't done that at scale in the last 50 years. So that's one area that we're heading into. And the other area that we're heading into is I want to come back and I want to highlight what Ty was speaking about, which is mending the bridge between science and spirit. This bridge was burned a long time ago, and it's only slowly starting to get mended again. And so Ty gives us a perfect window into that. After the first session, because first session can be highly destabilizing, as mentioned, that, you know, there are ways to work with the dosing so that it's not as strong of as an experience on the first wave. There's ways to impregnate the best sound experience, because under ketamine session with blindfolds, you really only have the sound because your body really goes kind of quiet for a while. Ketamine's an anesthetic. That's why it does that. So when you have the right sound, the right therapist, the right dosing, the destabilization isn't typically as pronounced. But on that second session, she comes back and she says, I realize it's all about love. And I was able to get close with death. It's like life and death in one session, right? That's the phenomenal power. And that happened spontaneously. That happened fairly, as my understanding. I didn't have a whole lot of time to ask Tyson more in-depth questions, but my understanding is that happened fairly unscripted. It's not like her therapist was leading her into love or inquiring about death. It just arose spontaneously. That's the ultimate power of these medicines, is to pull back the curtain of the subconscious and the superconscious, right? Subconscious being the deeper aspects of what we might call soul. When the ego is able to relax, we have a greater relationship with our own soul nature. And we opened up this call with one of our sponsors, Dr. Bronner's. Phenomenal backstory on that whole organization and current story on that whole organization and their desire to be the wind at the back of the entire psychiatric renaissance. I don't know if you've seen any of their branding lately, but it's kind of compelling. Heal all. Well, no, it went from all as one, right? That was like Dr. Emmanuel's kind of original statement. The old bottles, if you look on those old bottles, there's just fascinating stuff in there. Even the new bottles have fascinating stuff in there. Take some time and read one of the bottles with, you probably need a magnifying glass. And then now it's heal soul. Like that's the mission of this company. And they're highlighting this movement of psychedelic medicine, right? Psychedelic, psyche means mind in modern medicine. Well, in ancient medicine, psyche meant soul. Psyche is a Greek word that meant soul as much as it meant mind. And in the ancient medical establishments that have lasted thousands of years, our medicine has been around for barely 100. We're talking about the medical institutions, the Greek medicine, Egyptian medicine, Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine. Chinese and Ayurvedic medicine are still being practiced, and they've been around 35 and 4,500 years respectively. Greek medicine and Egyptian medicine were practiced for close to 1,000 years. All of those had a conversation of soul. All of those were tripartite systems where soul was one of the primary pillars. And it's only been in the modern advent of a bunch of technology that we've forgotten a conversation of soul and our own divine nature as it relates to healing. And so that's another part of this bridge that's being mended. And it's by stories like ties. One little brick in this bridge, mending this reconnection between science and spirit, because you cannot deny the consistent reports of people in psychedelic states speaking about spiritual experiences unprompted, unsolicited, unscripted. That was the first research that started the whole third wave of this movement. In the mid-90s, Rick Strassman did research on DMT. And it's very well known. You can go to the movie DMT, the spirit molecule. It's very good overview of that. And people were speaking about spiritual experiences, even though he didn't go in studying for that. He went in studying heart rate and blood pressure changes and physiologic changes, and people started coming out talking about God. And they were like, what the heck's happening here? And that has been consistent. And so it's part of our duty. And each of you on the call has a potential opportunity to be an ambassador for this work. And what I mean by that is, how do you speak about this work if you do? And I'm not saying you should. I'm just saying you have the opportunity to. And most, in my experience, I'm biased for sure. I think I'm also somewhat accurate, but surely I'm biased because I think medicines are pretty freaking amazing. And I say I'm biased because I've had my own experience. And so I'm compelled to share it from my own lens, but I've also done a fair bit of research at just looking at the neutral data to the best of my ability. And the data is also pretty freaking compelling. And so when I'm talking to a room of physicians, I just lead with data first and remind the physicians, oh, by the way, your duty under the Hippocratic Oath is to understand all the data to the best of your ability from a neutral perspective, offer that information to your client and let them make their best choice versus coming into the room because you think you know what they should be doing. And some physicians are really pressed to do that because they only have on average 11 minutes with each client. So I'm not saying that disparagingly against my colleagues. I'm just wanting to remind people what is our original oath of service to our patients and clients. and to the collective, especially as psychiatrists who are supposed to be a voice for the mind as much as a voice for the soul among the table of other physicians. So I get the sense we're reclaiming our role as a medical field, and I encourage people to get educated to the best of your ability. And then if you choose to be an ambassador of this work by sharing that message with other people, it's good to lead with information. That's why I wrote A Dose of Hope, because I wanted to just lead with a story of information about what this work is all about and not make it too technologically, confusing or too way out there. Like, oh, that's an acid trip that I saw, my friends go through and they never quite came back the same. It's like, there's a whole lot of medicines out there and a whole lot of different experiences to have. So what we're talking about is the right therapeutic use of these tools that help us reconnect with a more intimate experience with our own divine nature. And divine nature that can mean anything. Insert your word for what divine nature means. I love Bob Marley in that regard. Bob Marley said, "Love is my religion." Phenomenal. I'd say that's a very good religion to go pray to and pray up. And I've heard it also said by some of my teachers, actually, that nature was my first church. Amazing. Fabulous church to attend. Like if all of us just attended the church in nature a little bit more often and prayed up the gospel of love a little bit more often, I think we'd probably be a little bit more net positive. And it's kind of fascinating that the medicine paths just by nature tend to lead us back to those experiences, to get right with ourselves, to heal those traumatized parts, to heal those exiled, wounded aspects that we haven't been able to claim or to even find, to bring those intimate, traumatized parts back home, to become more whole. And as we become more whole, to become more in love with life. And as we become more whole, when we approach the doorway out at the time of death, and we pass through that portal, through that last major initiation of this one life, we pass through that portal more fulfilled, more at ease, less regrets, because we're lifted up with the wholeness of who we are and the gratitude for what we've had the opportunity to be a part of. I mean, it's sacred work. I tend to speak on the sacred side of the science conversation. So if it doesn't land, wonderful. This isn't, I'm not trying to preach the gospel or enlist anybody, because we can take the sacred kind of lens to this work, and we can also take the science lens and just look at the data. Data is pretty freaking good. If you just stay with the data, we're still net positive. And I think there's an opportunity to also hold both, where we look at both the science and the sacred. And we realize maybe part of this sacred thing that's happening is supporting the science to be as good as it is. They may not be that disconnected. I think it's just our worldview and the medical paradigm today that has them that disconnected. So I thank Ty and Evan for the opportunity to share both of your stories, because they really, I was going to share something else, and those stories were so compelling, I just shelved everything else I thought I was going to talk about, because that's the magic of it, is right there, and just talking with the people. And maybe I'll just close with this before I move to the Q&A. That's what I'd say. We have two equally powerful missions with Thank You Life. One is the as best we can support the equal access to care for all people to be able to experience this kind of work. Finances should not be the primary barrier to entry. And I think equal to that mission and in support of that mission is telling the story of people's healing process and the story of their journey through the medicine path. Ketamine is the one we're working with right now. As mentioned, we will work with other medicines in due time as the legal landscape evolves. The reason I'm so driven to help people tell their story is because, Ronnie and I have talked about this in the past. Data moves science, but story moves culture. And that's what we're doing here, is we're wanting to have people, if they feel compelled, to be able to share their story, because it's those stories that can inspire somebody else when somebody else might be standing on the ledge thinking that there's no hope. Because I don't know what it was like for my sister to go through that. That had to have been a hell realm. And so when we get to tell the story and we get to share that with others, you don't have any idea how just one story can make all the difference in a person's life. So we're doing our humble best, and I think we're doing a pretty good job. And I think our trajectory is pretty freaking amazing to be able to continue to tell those stories. So I want to just give you each gratitude for coming on the call and hearing this story about what we're doing with our organization. And if you feel compelled to share your story and lift somebody else up, I get the sense that that might be one of the most important things for us to do in this time of transformation. And I get the sense that our culture, our society, our world is going through a significant transformational time. And transformation is not always easy, but I think it's typically necessary. Just like the butterfly has these imaginal cells when it's a caterpillar that magically kick into gear at the end of that caterpillar's stage, that propels the cocoon and that propels the butterfly. So I get the sense we're in that metamorphosis time. And being able to share these stories, I think, can be just the right lifeline for many, and that wind at someone's back, and that flag of inspiration to help them through their own transformation, to find their own wings and be able to fly. So with that, look at this. Ronnie, I'm doing better than typical. I'm kind of a minute early. How about we get to some questions, and I'm going to try and run through these questions. We've got 20 minutes for Q&A, and I'm going to try and run through these questions pretty efficiently. So take notes if you want to. That might help. It may spring other questions, because I want to offer the spontaneity for other questions to arise. The questions that I'm asking are questions that people wrote in ahead of time. And I'd like to leave a few minutes for questions if anybody else has any. And then we'll wrap up with Laura closing us out. Okay. So first question. I'd love to hear Dr. Dan's thoughts on ketamine used to treat specific diagnosis versus the betterment of well people. Where is the greatest potential? Excellent question. We kind of framed it earlier when we said there's two doorways into the medicine path. One is healing and one is optimization. This question highlights that. When we're coming into the healing phase, we're talking about healing. It could be a variety of things, but the largest number of presenting psychiatric symptoms fall into these primary 5 epidemics: depression, anxiety, PTSD, addiction, and chronic pain. Ketamine is good for all of those. It's principally good for chronic treatment-resistant depression, and it's been used for over 30 years for that. We're now seeing that it is also quite good for anxiety and PTSD. Addiction is variably good. There's some people that have been extraordinarily healed by ketamine when they've had an addiction to something else. And I haven't seen really any research at scale that has been able to show the larger scale effects of ketamine for broad-based addiction. I do know it's been helpful. I've seen those case studies. It makes sense to me because it's such a good pattern interrupter. It also makes good sense because most addictive chemicals create inflammation in the brain. And one of the reasons to continue to use is to quiet the pain of the trauma but it increases the inflammation in the brain. So it's kind of this vicious cycle. And ketamine can address both the trauma piece and the inflammation piece, right? Like we were talking about before, software and hardware. And it also has an addiction side. And somebody asked later, so I'm going to bring in another question. Oh no, some people have written in our team curious about the ketamine abuse potential. Yes, ketamine does have an abuse potential. Anybody that says otherwise is lying, or they just don't have the data. And the reason I say some people are lying is because we have been lied to. Go look at Ben Goldacre's TED Talk on publication bias, and then the distortion from the pharmaceutical industry about giving transparent data for clinical research trials. 90% of all the positive trials that show the medication is good are published, and only 8% of the negative trials that show medication are not good are published, right? So just get that first and foremost. The vast majority of all the trials that show medications are good are published. The vast majority of clinical trials that show medications are not good are never published, right? So that's a lie by exemption, and that's not an ethical or integrous practice. So the reason I say sometimes people are lying is because they have an agenda. Ketamine does have an abuse potential, and it makes sense that it would, because if somebody's in massive pain and ketamine helps that pain, then they're probably going to use it again. And the only time something would go from therapeutic to abused is because if somebody's using the thing that was healing too much and it caused a side effect. And there's the drive to continue to use even in the midst of side effects. And the long side effect with ketamine is something called interstitial cystitis, which is a really nasty ulcerative condition within the bladder wall lining, and it creates this really intense burning sensation upon peeing. But some people are needing the experience of the pain relief so much psychically and maybe somewhere else in the body that they're willing to put up with that intense burning when they urinate. We would call that an abuse, because they're now cycling into an experience where the side effects are pronounced. And so ideally we find medicines that are very therapeutic and they don't have an abuse potential because there's no downside. And there are medicines that fit that category. There would be a longer conversation, but just to keep it brief. So yes, ketamine can be good for addiction. It does have a bit of an abuse potential. The last of those 5 is chronic pain syndromes. And ketamine can be good for chronic pain syndromes. It's a unique kind of way to use it. A friend right now is going through a 8-day ketamine intensive as a clinical trial in Canada, and they're giving him ketamine IV infusion for 16 hours a day for 8 days. So he's kind of staying pretty ketamine stoned all day. And if you've ever had chronic pain, most people on this call have had at least acute pain. Can you imagine having really acute pain, never go away? Now you're getting into chronic pain experience, and chronic pain is extraordinarily hard to deal with. And so there's a woman physician in Canada who's been showing really amazing results with these long-term infusion rates of ketamine, because it's rewiring the neurologic pain signaling. And so we're just in this really cool arena of a bunch of trials and a bunch of research and a bunch of curious doctors doing a bunch of amazing things, right? So those are the big 5. Ketamine's good for all of those, as well as the other doorway in, which is for well people, optimization. I came into the medicine path relatively well. I mean, relatively, I had a lot of post-concussive syndrome that I didn't know at the time from just a bunch of sports-related head injuries. But what the prayer for me is, I went through a divorce. I couldn't feel it. I was emotionally shut down. I was super cold, and I knew I didn't want to live the rest of my life like that. And so I made a prayer in a sweat lodge to help open this. I was studying Lakota medicine at the time. I just needed something to help open my heart. And a brother of mine, who became later my best friend, heard that prayer, and he said, "I think you might want to get to know ayahuasca." And I was like, Never heard of it. You seem reasonable. Let's do that. So 3 weeks later, I found myself in an ayahuasca circle, and I learned more about myself in one weekend with ayahuasca than I had in 1 decade of psychiatry training. So I was relatively well. And to Ty's point, it helped me come back into a place of love. So that's where I think that we have the opportunity to offer these medicines, not just for healing, but also for optimization, because I get the sense that it should be our choice. And this was the early Oregon legislation that passed 3 years ago. There was essentially, if people want to have a psilocybin experience and they're over 21 and they don't have any contraindications and they're willing to come for 2 treatments with a number of therapy sessions for preparation and integration, great, let them come. Because it should be our right to explore our consciousness. So I think both doorways have merit. So second question. Information around clients who've had a long history of SSRIs and clients still wanting to pursue psilocybin sessions. What dose required effects? What dosage effects are there yet? So people on SSRIs, it's the most commonly used class of psychiatric medications, as well as being the most commonly used class of antidepressant psychiatric medications. SSRIs do affect psilocybin breakthrough experiences, but the new research show it's pretty safe. Using psilocybin, and I'm not your physician, so this isn't a blanket like stamp of approval to go start exploring, especially on your own. But what I will say, the early research shows that it seems to be pretty safe. Say if somebody was 150 milligrams of Zoloft, which is kind of a moderate dose, then taking a fairly moderate dose of say 2 to 3 grams of dried psilocybin mushrooms would be pretty safe. However, the SSRIs put a dampener on the experience, so they probably won't have as much of a breakthrough process happen. So that's number one, just on like the therapeutic breakthrough side. What I will say that's been pretty freaking amazing for so many people is microdosing psilocybin to help people come off of SSRI medications. Again, I'm not your physician, so I'm not saying blanket stamp of approval to go ahead and try and do that, but I will say that there's a lot of good information. You may have to weed through a fair number of things on the internet. Reddit posts, Erowid, EROWID, is kind of a long-standing psychedelic treatment library. The Third Wave, I think it's thirdwave.co. It could be thirdwave.com. They have a whole lot of information about microdosing there and people's experiences transitioning off of SSRIs. Lucid News is another just kind of really good journalistic place that shares information, including research and occasionally case stories about people in the current psychedelic landscape. I think they probably have the best wide-ranging kind of media news platform. And there doesn't seem to be any long-term, or at least data doesn't show long-term negative impacts of having a trial of psilocybin while somebody's on SSRIs. Now, if somebody's on a high dose of SSRIs, like say 300 milligrams of Zoloft versus 50 milligrams of Zoloft, that's a little different. I don't know where the data is. I think they were just looking at moderate doses. But the thing is, psilocybin has no LD50, which means there's no lethal dose, which means you could eat a trash bag of dried mushrooms and not die. You would probably not feel very good, and you would probably vomit a lot. But that's the benefit of working with natural medicines, is the body has safeguards built in, like, oh, foreign invader, toxic substance, get it out. Get it out from above or get it out from below. One way, your body's going to want to try and get it out if you've had too much, but you won't die. You can't, there's no lethal dose. So psilocybin is extraordinarily safe. Question number 3. I would like to hear, Thank You Life long-term mission. Ooh. Good question. I would bucket our long-term mission into 3 areas. clinical, research, and policy. Now, we're not huge political drivers in the space. We might want to have a voice to local politicians to understand the benefit of this work. There's already a whole lot of organizations doing that, so we tend to partner with those. So when I say policy, part of our mission is to be the wind at the level of policy reform, including decriminalization and legalization. I would say that's more of a secondary tier mission, with our primaries being on the clinical side and the research side. We are not a clinical organization, but what we do is we help people get together. Not quite like Match.com for psychedelics, but something in that kind of arena where like said person wants to have an experience and wants to know where a potential excellent treatment provider might be. And is this person that's wanting an experience able to get some financial support because they wouldn't be able to afford it on their own? So one of the things that we do is we try and match those people together. So we have a growing, very good national database of networked providers. And that's been a rich community to cultivate. When we came in, I thought we would be really focusing on cultivating the client community. And we are, and that's been amazing. What we didn't expect is cultivating the clinician community, and that's been really cool too. So we're doing that, and now we're doing that more and more at scale. So I'd say that's on the clinical side, is we're working in that way to remove the barrier of finances being the challenge. And then on the research side, this is a bit of what I was alluding to before around telling the story. Cataloging not just the outcome rates and how people's symptoms have improved, but also telling their life story, their story of their healing process, and being able to fill in some of the things that you just can't get on like a psychometric scale. You know, how has your life, not just did your life improve, but how did your relationships improve? How'd your quality of life improve? How has your excitement for life? Because that's ultimately what we want everybody to come to, is their own thank you life moment. Like the opportunity to say, thank you life. Thank you for my life. Thank you for the opportunity to be alive. Thank you for what is mine to do to support the whole. Thank you for the appreciation I have for my family, for my health, for nature. Yeah, those are the subtle aspects. That's the storytelling. And what I would love to see more formally done too is us engage what I call the healed human impact, a longitudinal research, prospective study to see how people's life change across all these different metrics: biometrics, neurometrics, psychometrics, life metrics. How does your body heal when your mind heals? How does your nervous system correlate to the mind healing in the body? We can track those. Those are easy to do on labs and blood tests and brain scans. It's the psychometrics that are like, okay, my symptoms got better, but also because I had these kind of mystical experiences that were pretty cool. There's some really cool scales that you can do and questionnaires to take about what your mystical experience was like. And then the life metrics is like, how did my life change? Kind of like I was talking about before. What I want to do is I want to track all that data over 1, 5, 10, and 20 years. The longest study ever done was by Harvard. It was an 80-year study and looked at longevity. And they found that the #1 factor for longevity, maybe Ty already knows this, so I would just be learning from her, is the quality of our relationships. Better than genetics, better than what you eat, how much you move, how well you sleep. All those things are important, but the #1 factor is the quality of our relationships. It's a really compelling summary statement about how we're born to bond. And it really matters how we feel about one another and how we treat one another, maybe more than a bunch of other things that we even try and focus on more actively. So the only way that they could tell that study is to do this longer 80-year study. So that's what I want to do, is I want to be able to capture that data so that I can go back, and we as an organization can go back to the insurance providers and say, you know what? our treatment is cheaper than the current payouts that you provide your average client with chronic severe depression on an annual basis. Our treatment's better and it's cheaper. And oh, by the way, not only is it better and cheaper, but have you looked at what happens to their life after that? It actually gets this much better because their life was on this kind of stuck trajectory of chronic depression or any of those other epidemics. And then we intervened and they got on this treatment and their life went that way. And over 20 years, it looked like that. That's the story that I want to tell. So I would say that's part of our long-term mission. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to open up the floor, but let's see how we can do. What do you think it will take to get ketamine covered by insurance? Boom. I just answered that one. I think we have to tell the story. And I think insurance providers have to know not only does it benefit their bottom line, it's actually their civic duty to try and support people to have their best life ever, not just to manage things that are uncomfortable in chronic disease. Our current medical system is not very good at managing chronic disease in the first place. So I think the insurance system kind of needs a bit of a revamp too. But by telling this story, I think the grassroots movement just puts pressure on the insurance providers to cover it because somebody's going to do it. And then people will just opt out of a current existing insurance profile of covered benefits and go over to this one because this one provides it and this one doesn't. And insurance companies are already doing this, by the way, but it's not quite as active as I'd hope, but we're getting there. Last question. What advice can you give about embracing the ego death for an individual to be able to let go during their healing journey? That's a really cool question. You know, it's a beautifully framed question because some of Ty's first experience was a beautiful example of that. It was like ego death process. It was like, whoa, this whole new thing's happening up. It's a little freaky. Am I going to make it out through this? Who am I going to be on the other side? Is this ever going to end? You know, ego's going to kick and scratch and claw and like try and keep things normal, even if normal is not healthy. Because there's two primary drives, safety and growth. Safety is what the ego does. Growth is what the soul does. And so when we go through that kind of process and the ego's freaked out because now everything that is known as safety is being like slowly peeled away. The reason I laugh is because a friend told me a long time ago, like a bad day for the ego is typically a good day for the soul. And I've held that in many challenging ceremonies. Like, oh, this is excruciatingly uncomfortable. I'm glad my soul's having such a good time. And so I think, so that comes to, okay, like what would I tell a person to be able to soften that ego death experience? Number one is trust the process. If you can trust your facilitator, you can trust the medicine, you can trust where you're at, that's going to be infinitely supportive. Number two is have faith that anything uncomfortable is actually working for your benefit. Like there's no malevolent spirits in this arena, you know, hoping that you're going to suffer. It's usually the ego just having a really uncomfortable time letting go of control. And if you can just really program your faith to be steady, for whatever comes, I'm going to just continue to hold my faith that it's important, even if I don't know why. That's the definition of faith, is believing in something even without evidence. And so just keep the faith. Trust the process, keep the faith. And then the third is let go of expectations. That's probably the biggest handicap to this work, is having an idea of what we think is supposed to happen and getting disappointed when it doesn't. Because there may be something more important and better that is unfolding that I couldn't have even scripted. And if I'm so focused on what didn't happen that I thought was supposed to happen, then I might be ignoring this awesome thing that's waiting for me to embrace. It's just staring at me, but I won't look at it. And typically, in my experience, with those 3 in your toolkit, the chances are good you're going to be net positive. Okay. Well, we didn't get to spontaneously arising questions from the gallery, but I think we did pretty darn good in managing our time. So thank you each and all. Much love to you and yours. Thank you for what is yours to do to help the world become even more magical and a better place. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your interest in supporting our group and our organization. And yeah, privileged to be here. Thank you to the team again for offering me the opportunity to do this. And with all that, Laura, I'll give it back to you.
Thanks, Dan. Not much to add, but just to thank everybody again for coming. Thank you, Dan, for your time. I know how in demand you are, and off to another retreat soon. Thank you, Kelsey, for being here to welcome Dan. And yeah, thank you to all of you, really for being here today, but also for just your support of this movement. I know nobody is here who doesn't really care about the future of humanity, and that we're all here because we love humanity and want to serve others and end suffering. And thank you, life is doing its small part. And so I hope that you all stay in the family, stay connected, support us when and how you can. And yeah, see us again at the next Fireside Chat, if not before. And yeah, deep gratitude to all. And yeah, have a beautiful rest of your evening. Thank you so much for being here.